Hello, vintage outboard motor fans. This is T-Mike here on Toledo Bend Lake. It's a cold, rainy morning in November. Having my coffee this morning, thinking about making a video. Had a subscriber contact me wanting to know how to remove a flywheel. Okay, so I've had this request several times. I guess I took it for granted that I've made the video, and I haven't. So I'm going to make one this morning on how to remove a flywheel, but I'm going to take it to a different level. I'm going to give you some background and some do's and don'ts about the flywheel removal and installation. So it's going to be a 5-part video. Okay, first part is going to be the characteristics of the flywheel and why it's so hard to take off, and why it's important that you put it back on correctly. All right, so that's part 1. Part 2 are going to be the tools you're going to need to do the job properly. You can get in a bind if you don't have the right tools and you mess up the threads or the nut, or you can get in a bind not doing it right. All right, part 3 is going to be how to actually remove the flywheel. I have a 1958 10 horsepower sitting right here. I'm going to remove the flywheel and show you how it's done right. All right, the 4th part is going to be how to install the flywheel, how to put it back on properly. And then the 5th part is going to be the do's and don'ts of removing and installing a flywheel. I hope y'all enjoy the video. If everybody's ready, here we go. Okay, so part 1, the characteristics of the flywheel. So I've made several videos on how the flywheel works, the magnet, creating the spark. I have several videos on the flywheel. These characteristics can be just the physical characteristics when it comes to removal and installing. All right, so pretty obvious. There's a hole in the center of it that goes down on the camshaft, right? So here, this is the camshaft, same thing that's inside that motor that the flywheel sits on. Biggest characteristics is that the camshaft is beveled. See how it's smaller at the top than it is at the bottom? And the center hole of the flywheel is beveled also. So when this flywheel goes on, there's a keyway with a Woodruff key in it. See it right there? See that Woodruff key? And there's a key for that Woodruff inside here. So when it goes on, that slot has to match the Woodruff key. And then the nut that is screwed on here, all right, is screwed on and torqued to so many foot-pounds. We're going to get to that later. And that torquing presses the flywheel down on the bevel part of the camshaft and jams it in there. It's very important that the flywheel be tight. This motor's spinning at a lot of RPMs and needs to be squarely on there, so it's pressed onto that bevel. That's why it's so hard to pop off, because it's squeezed onto that bevel. The two bevels are tightened together and it takes pressure to pop it off. All right, so that's the most important characteristics of the flywheel. All right, now we'll move on to part 2 and the tools that you need to actually take it off. All right, so here's the tools you're going to need to take the flywheel off and put it back on. So you're going to need an impact wrench, all right, with a 1/2-inch socket on it to take the nut off the top of the flywheel. All right, then you're going to need a flywheel puller that screws on to those 3 screws right there. This is a 189 harmonic balancer flywheel puller. It's made by Calvan Tools. You can get it on Amazon for $24.45. All right, so you're going to need a Phillips screwdriver to screw the nuts down in. You're going to need a 1/2-inch wrench to tighten this up. Once it's screwed in, you're going to need a ball peen hammer to beat on the top here to get it off. And then when you put it back on, you're going to need a torque wrench, and we're going to talk about all that in a minute. You might also need a manual to get the torque specifications for your particular plywood. I recommend the C-Lock manuals. Johnson Evinrude Outboard, 1956 to 70. That's the parts manual I recommend. So there's the tools we're going to need to do this project. All right, so let's move to part 3 now and actually take one off of that motor right there. All right, so let's remove the flywheel. So first thing you do is take your impact drill with a 1/2 inch socket and take off the nut. Comme ça. Okay, once the nut is off, the flywheel is stuck on that beveled camshaft. It ain't gonna come off. So you take your harmonic balancer and you screw in the 3 screws, put the tip right there on the top of the crankshaft. Take your 3 screws, put them in about 10 turns. All right, then you want to tighten up the thread, which is trying to pull the thing off. So normally you would take your 1/2 inch and stick it on top here, but I've beat on this thing so much that it's flattened it out. I can't get a drill on it, so I take a wrench and tighten it. Tighten it as tight as you can. Then take a ball peen hammer and strike the top right here till it pops it off. And there it did, it popped it off. All right, so then you unscrew this. Unscrew your threads. And it pops right off. That's how you remove the flywheel. Now let's move into the next section, which is how to install it. All right, so the installation is pretty simple. You have a slot where the woodruff key is right there. You want to drop the flywheel into that slot. Okay. Then you want to take your nut and you want to screw the nut on. All right, take your now you're going to want to torque it on. You have to torque it on where it squeezes down tight onto the bevel. So you're going to need to know the specifications for the torque. That's where the manual comes in. If I look at my manual, for a 10 horsepower 1956 to 1963, it takes 480 to 540. It says the values are given in inch pounds. Divide by 12 for foot pounds. So 480 divided by 12 is 40. So I'm going to do 40 foot pounds. My torque wrench is gauged in foot pounds. I have it set to 40 foot pounds. So I'm going to get on here and torque it. Now the flywheel is going to want to turn. So I take a 2x4 and I stick it down between the prop and the base of here, so that when you turn it, the prop pushes against the 2x4 and freezes it. I don't have a gear case on this motor, so I can't show you, but basically 2x4 goes in between here. So when you're turning it, the prop jams it and you can apply the pressure to get it to 40 foot-pounds. But you need to look up on your motor what the foot-pound specs are. So that's how you install it. All right, now part 5 of the video are the do's and don'ts. So I'm going to give you some tips here on what will make it easy for you and hopefully not get you to put yourself in a bind by doing the wrong thing. So one of the do's I would recommend is the threads on your camshaft and the thread on your nut are very important. What happens, especially if your motor has been used by somebody else and they've done the don'ts of beating on this nut to get the flywheel off, it damages the threads. And then you'll take it off with your impact wrench and force it on with the impact wrench and strip the threads. If you strip the threads on this camshaft, your power head is pretty much shot, because this camshaft goes all the way down inside. You have to replace the camshaft. So what I recommend is that you chase the threads. It's called chasing the threads. Get you a die and a tap, all right? The size is a 1/2 inch fine by 20. 1/2 NF by 20, and chase the threads. You know anything about tapping dies, it makes the threads spin it till it chases the threads and makes them perfect. And then the same thing with the nut. Take the same 1/2 NF by 20 and chase these threads where the threads are fine, and that way you're sure that your nut will go back on the threads. All right. The other do that I highly recommend is that you torque it correctly. If you don't torque it correctly, you'll shear the woodruff key, because the flywheel is loose and it'll be putting pressure on the woodruff key. So you'll shear that woodruff key if you don't torque it properly. All right. That's the do's I recommend. Now here's the don'ts. All right. Too many people will remove a flywheel by taking the nut and backing it off to where it doesn't show, or even if back it to here, and then they'll put a screwdriver under the flywheel and take a ball-peen hammer and hit it to take the flywheel off. That works. You can get a flywheel off, especially if it's not been torqued properly, but you'll damage this thread on this nut and ruin your motor. All right. So don't beat on the nut or the camshaft to get your flywheel off. Use the proper procedure that I just showed you to remove your flywheel. So if you follow all that, everything should work fine. All right, so now let's summarize. All right, we talked about the characteristics of the flywheel, the bevel of the flywheel, and the slotted woodruff key. We talked about the tools you'll need, show you what the flywheel puller you need, all the proper tools that you need. We talked about the proper way to remove the flywheel. All right, we talked about the proper way to install the flywheel, and we talked about the do's and don'ts about how to remove and install a flywheel. So I hope this helped you. I enjoyed making the video. I always do. Keep the requests coming in. If I don't have a video you need, let me know. I'll make one. Once again, my goal is to have every video that you need to work on this motor. And I have all the parts now that you need. So check out my eBay store and you get all the parts you need for your motor. Hope you all enjoyed it. See you next video. Thanks for watching the video. I hope y'all enjoyed it. If you did, please click on subscribe and tell all your friends about T Mike's Vintage Outboards YouTube channel. Also, I have dozens of links below in the description. You can find my eBay store, all the parts I have in there. You can find my trusted T Mike parts, where I make kits for fuel pump conversions, for your carburetors, for your magnetos and your gear cases. You also have a link for my mail-in repair service, how to send me your parts to repair and send them back to you. Also a link in there for technical consulting if you need some help with your vintage motors. So I love what I do. I love all the videos that you guys have requested for me to make. Keep the requests coming in, and I'll keep making the videos. And remember, always remember, and never forget, here at T Mike's Vintage Outboards, we're doing it one motor at a time.